Thank you for coming. I'm Hannah McGurk. I'm a writer and a researcher based here in Edinburgh, and I'm part of a collective looking at Black and Brown Scottish history and imperial and colonial legacies. That's why I'm so excited to talk tomorrow. I absolutely loved your book, Black and Gold. I read it pretty much in one sitting, like on a train ride from London to Edinburgh. And it's just, am I not on? Thank you. Hello? Oh, is that better? Yeah, okay.
Well, not for long.
Not for long. There we go. Is that better? Yeah. Great. I read this book pretty much in one sitting on a train ride from London to Edinburgh, and I absolutely adored it. I think that kind of storytelling is mostly reserved for younger readers these days. So it was really, really special. So thank you. So Mara Menzies is a narrative artist who draws on her rich, dual Kenyan Scottish heritage to create worlds that explore contemporary issues through legend, myth, and fantasy. Her storytelling performance, Blood and Gold, which inspired this book, premiered at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2019 to rapturous praise. She has toured in 27 countries. Thank you, Mara.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to tell us a bit about Blood and Gold and where it came from?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, it started out as a stage show, as a storytelling show at the Edinburgh Fringe a couple of years ago, and I really I was interested in just looking at the legacy of colonialism and slavery. I grew up in Kenya, which is a colonized country, and a lot of the laws that are still in place were put in by the British government, and they're not always appropriate to the indigenous population. So it is still quite colonized in many ways. And also I think there's just, the sort of just the narrative, people speak about it, all the time, but often, or it comes across sometimes that there's just sort of one way of speaking about it. So I wanted to find different ways of looking at the legacy and how we live with that now, both in Scotland, but just across the world as well. And because I love myth and legend and fantasy, and I felt that was a really interesting way of looking at it, because you're looking at different themes. You're looking at oppression, you're looking at greed, power, all of these things, and all of them exist in myth. And by exploring it, by creating these worlds where all of these themes exist, we're able to sort of take a step back, in a sense, and look at things from an outside perspective without it being, right or wrong, good or bad, because we all know the facts of the matter, but sometimes it can create barriers to actually having conversations about it, whereas by doing it this way, I thought this is softly approach to kind of looking at these issues. So yeah, but I framed it from the perspective of there's a dying mother, and she has this daughter, and she wants her daughter to know certain things. When you raise your children, you want to protect them, you want to grow them into strong people, and the ways that we can be strong is to know our roots, is to know our heritage, who we come from, where we come from. So the best way for her was through stories. So she takes these stories and she puts them in a box. But there's a character called the Shadow Man, and the Shadow Man understands the power of stories and does not want the box to be opened. But of course, the box is opened and all the stories come out. So that is how it was framed.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a bit about what it was like to perform that? And you toured it in so many countries. What was the reception like? How did people react to it?
So it didn't tour to that many countries. I've toured to 27 countries, but it toured to quite a few. But I enjoyed the process of crafting it, and it was part of the Made in Scotland showcase, which sort of funds, Scottish shows to be at the Fringe, and it was really important to stick to storytelling because they'd never funded a storytelling show, and sort of traditional theatre is, I guess you sit, you watch, you clap whether you like it or not, and then you go and get your cappuccino. So I thought, to the people who would come to see the show were primarily a theatre audience, and storytelling can be quite frightening for people, especially the ones in the front row who are like, don't choose me, don't choose me. So I thought it would be really lovely to just introduce people or reintroduce people to the art of storytelling, because it's very much a relationship between the storyteller and the audience, and it's never the same. It's never really memorized. When you're doing it time and time again, it can often find its rhythm. However, whatever the audience gives you, you have to respond to that and bring that into the story, and you incorporate different ideas. So when I was putting it together, I was sitting on the stage as the audience were coming in, And so many people were thinking, you know, why is she doing that? Is it, you know, the black gaze, or, you know, looking at the female body, or whatever it is, you know, what's the reason for that? And it was just to kind of clock where people were sitting, actually, because that way I knew that when the lights went down, I wouldn't be able to see the audience. But you need to be able to, you know, with storytelling, you want to see people, look them in the eye and make them feel as if they are the person you're telling the story to. So I would say, okay, so there's that color hair there, you know, there's a funky mask right over there. So in my head, I knew where people were. So throughout the show, I could kind of bring them in different ways without necessarily being able to see them, and ask for their input, and you know, bring them in gradually, because the worst thing to do is, you know, right, okay, you come on up and, you know, help me with the show. But like, no, please. But just simple things, you know, like just asking them to respond, you know, who would do this, and, you know, what kind of food do you like? Stuff that people know and are comfortable engaging with, but then they just kind of gradually get into it more and more, and it's a really beautiful thing to watch, actually.
Yeah. That's something I wanted to ask you about as well, because I don't know much about storytelling as a profession. So I was wondering, what traditions are you drawing from? Is there anything that you're trying to challenge as a storyteller? And yeah, how did you become one?
So yeah, storytelling, it's not your normal profession. It's not something that the guidance teachers at school propose. And I fell into it quite accidentally. So I grew up in Kenya, as I said, and but my teenage years were spent here. And when I was expecting my daughter, I really wanted this child to identify with her African heritage. And so again, for me, it was through stories. I thought that was the way to do it, because in Kenya, we lived in quite a rural area, so we didn't have television. It was, you know, 1 hour on a Wednesday evening, we'd go to the local hotel, and that was my TV watching. So the rest of the time, I grew up with all these stories, my mother, my grandmother, people coming for dinner, and just, it was very, very natural. And so I had all these stories, and I thought, oh, I know these stories, so I'm going to write a book. You know, we've all been there. I'm going to write a book. So I did, and I found an illustrator, and I published I printed 1,000 copies, and my friends and family all bought a copy, and then there was still 900 and something, and it was, oh my God. So I thought, I need to sell this book. So I would hire centers and halls and invite people to come and hear the story in the hope that they would buy the book. And then it just grew from there, because I never read the book. I would just tell the story, and you'd watch the audience, and just somehow you'd just kind of respond to what they were giving you. And there was somebody who came and then introduced me to the Scottish Storytelling Centre. And I went there, and it was the first time that I knew storytelling or understood it as a profession. And I thought, oh my God, this is amazing, this incredible world. And just the different kinds of storytellers, you know, big performance storytellers, and then the little quiet ones who sit there, but you're gripped to every single word that they say. So it was really magical. So I became a storyteller. But the lovely thing about it is that you actually make it your own, because there is no fixed way of being a storyteller. So obviously it started out with the book. It was a book for children, a picture book. So it started off telling stories for children, and that was really to sort of tell stories that challenged the perception of Africa, because when I came, what I saw on television was not my Africa. It was, yeah, okay, we were barefoot, but we had shoes at home. We just didn't want to wear them because it was not comfortable. So, you know, the things that I saw, I didn't identify with. So I started to just tell stories that I felt kind of address the balance a little bit. But then as time passed, you begin to really see how stories can affect people in different ways. So from then till now, you know, I've worked in Colombia with the British Council for peace building, storytelling for peace building, worked with Maasai communities in East Africa about female genital mutilation. So telling stories that will encourage people to kind of think about changing behavior in a sense. And it's really quite a powerful way of doing it, because, you know, with the Maasai community, you can't go into a culture that has this, for me, a very brutal, unnecessary tradition and expect people to change. So I told a story that had nothing to do with Maasai, had nothing to do with FGM. It was a story from the Kikuyu tribe, so a completely different ethnic group, different traditions, customs, and it was about this woman who was not allowed to eat meat and the challenges that she went through in order to finally change the system in her community. And so, of course, we were telling the story, and, you know, the stories, it kind of gets into the cracks of the soul, you know. And after the story was told, then we'd sort of explore, we'd ask the question, you know, what kind of traditions exist in this community? and you don't have to do anything, actually. They sort of come up with, well, actually, in our community, these are some of the traditions that exist. And then you kind of start to explore it, because, stories always interconnect. And when you hear a story, it will remind you of certain things that you've experienced yourself. And so they kind of trigger so many different emotions and memories and ideas. And and they're all interweaved. So somebody challenging a tradition applies to any tradition. Could be, even in Scotland, we drink a lot of alcohol, right? Okay, how do we challenge that tradition? Or, honor killings or whatever, any kind of tradition, we can use stories to actually challenge it. And one story can touch on many, many different issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
On that note, Mara, would you tell us a story?
Yes, I will tell a story. So I'm not going to read my story because maybe at some point you might read it, and I think it might be interesting to maybe see the difference between how a story is told and then how a story is written. And now I'm trying to think which story I should tell, because I did have an idea.
Yeah.
Now do I tell that one? No, I will stick to the original story. And this story that I'm going to tell is the story of a young Somali student whose name was Ahmed Sheikh, or it's inspired by his story. And he lived in Edinburgh in 1989, and he was out in the Grassmarket, and he was stabbed to death in a racist murder. He was speaking to a white woman. Somebody didn't like it, and he was stabbed to death. And a lot of people consider it the Stephen Lawrence case of Scotland, because nobody was ever brought to justice for his murder. But his story it's not really told. It's easily forgotten, one of those things that we like to put to one side. But that is also a legacy of colonialism and slavery, because obviously the racism that we see in today's society is directly connected to what happened to justify slavery and the maltreatment of human beings. So I'm going to stand for this. I think. I'll see how limited I am with space. Oh no, I've got some space, okay. So this story starts in a far, far away land, a beautiful place where the sand shimmered like a sheen of gossamer. The sun shone every single day, and the sky was so blue that from a distance you would think that this place was heaven on earth. But if you were to look closer, you would see that there was a poison that snaked its way through the sand, across the land, and into the souls of the leaders. It stripped them of all compassion, all humanity. It hardened their hearts and encased them in a cold shell. And so the people of this land suffered and struggled. But there was a man and his wife. And this man and his wife, they had a son, a beautiful child. Whenever they saw him and gazed into his eyes, they could see the stars and the planets sparkling and twinkling and shining, and they loved this child more than anything else in the world. And every single evening, they would sit together, and they would have prepared a delicious meal, and the father would regale them with story after story after story, and the food they ate was so, so delicious. Tell me, what's your favorite food? She has a lot of favorite foods. This is a really difficult question. Or what would you make for somebody you love? Pumpkin ravioli. Well, do you know when there was pumpkin ravioli that night? Well, first of all, she would go out into her garden and she would choose the juiciest, most succulent pumpkin. She would carefully slice into it, peel it apart, remove all the seeds, take that delicious flesh, place it into a pot, and she would boil and boil, adding in all of her delicious seasoning. And then came the ravioli part. Oh my goodness. She would go out into the wheat fields. She would take that wheat. She would grind into that finest, is it AA flour? Yeah, that really fine flour. And then she would begin to knead it into a delicious dough. She would spread it out. She would slice into it. She would delicately scoop tiny little pieces of this delicious pumpkin. She would fold it over and she would boil it, and her pumpkin ravioli was way better than yours. Oh, wow, she would make meal after meal after meal. So tasty, so good. And they loved these evening gatherings. And as the boy grew, they noticed how smart he was, how curious he was about the world. And they began to think that perhaps this child could be the one who could help rid the land of this poison. But in order to do that, he needed skills, knowledge, and experience, something that he could never, ever find in his own land. He needed to be somewhere else, but where? And they began to think of the land in the sky. It was a wonderful place. Stories abounded. They knew that it was beautiful, rich with opportunity and resources, and they knew that this is where that young boy had to go. So they began to save up all their gold. And as the child grew, they started to borrow from all their friends and families. And as he grew into a young man, they sold off a piece of their land until they had a small bag filled with gold. And when the young boy, who was now a young man, had reached the time, they gave him that gold. They made some delicious pumpkin ravioli. They handed it over, and off he went. And he marched and he marched and he marched across those shimmering sands. He reached the mountains. He climbed up to the top, over the peaks, down the other side. He swam across raging rivers. He crossed the plains, and then in the distance, he saw a rope descending from the sky. He had arrived. So he grabbed that rope and he started to climb higher and higher and higher. But the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. And when they saw this young man approach, they sent wind and rain to knock him off his rope. But he clung on with all the strength that he possessed. And when the wind and the rain had eased, he continued to climb higher and higher and higher. But the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. And when they saw him continuing his ascent, they poured oil down that rope, and he began to slip and slide. So he gripped on with his fingernails and his teeth. And when the sun had dried up that oil, he continued to climb. But the land in the sky does not accept people too easily. And they sent hornets that stung his legs, his shoulders, his back. He cried out with pain, but he continued to climb. And just as he approached the land in the sky, they set fire to that rope. And when he saw it beginning to fray, he reached into his pocket. He pulled out the gold. And when they saw it gleaming, their eyes widened. They grabbed that young man and they welcomed him in. And when he started to move around, he saw that his parents were right. It was a beautiful place. Opportunities came to him that he could only have ever imagined, and he took every single one of them. But one day, after he had spent the day with his friends, people who had come from distant lands like his own and others who had only ever known the land in the sky, he realized how much he loved them. He missed his family and he would send messages home on the wind, but he knew that his friends loved him in return. They could see the sparkle of the stars and the planets in his eyes. And the sun was high in the sky. They felt the warmth on their skin. It was a beautiful day, a rare, beautiful day. And they thought tonight is the night that we are going to have the best night of our lives. So they got themselves ready and they headed out to the liveliest part of the city. They went into the finest restaurants. They drank the finest drinks. The band was playing and they were dancing and shaking and having the most wonderful time when suddenly he looked out and he saw the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen. Her hair sparkled like the sun and her smile was as wide as the world, and his heart began to pound in his chest. Oh, you've been in love before, right? Yes? What happens to you? Your heart pounds, yeah? And do you feel confident? Do you approach them and say hello? Yeah? Uh-huh. No, no. Ah, so he could hardly speak. What happens to you when you're in love with somebody? Yes? Everything. Yeah, lots of amazing things. Goodness, this young man, he could hardly breathe. He went over and she saw the starlight in his eyes, and it wasn't long before the two of them were engaged deep in conversation. And as they were enjoying each other's company, they failed to notice a young man with a furrowed brow sitting at a table. And he watched this young couple as he swirled a golden liquid in his glass. And he was so fixated on them, he did not see the cracks in the ground. And the shadow man emerged, slither over the cobblestones, up the table, and pa, into his drink. And when he gazed into his glass, the shadow man began to cast his spell. Look at them, all smiles and laughter. Look at him. You know what he's after. Violent, aggressive, no sense of shame. Always in trouble, always to blame. I tell you all the time, this beast, it wants to gorge, it wants to feast, it wants to take the good, the just, but you can stop it. Yes, you must. And the young man, emboldened by these words, he stood up and he approached the young couple. Around him, the shadow man swirled, taking words, sharpening them into weapons and handing them over. And the young man with the furrowed brow took these weapons and he gazed in front of him, but there was no young man with sparkling eyes. In its place, there was a beast, a huge head, fists clenched, ready to smash and crush and destroy, fur on every pore of its body. And he took these weapons and he aimed them at the beast. And the young man with the sparkling eyes, he whipped around when he felt the words pierce his skin. And there in front of him was a loathsome creature, saliva dripping to the ground, its claws, its jaws glinting in the moonlight. It was hideous. And the two creatures lunged at each other and began to rip and tear, gouging, racing, tearing, throwing each other to the ground, smashing, destroying, when suddenly there was a glint, and the young man with the sparkling eyes, he fell backwards to the ground, clutching his stomach. As he fell and lay on the cobblestones, he looked up and he heard the moon and the stars calling him home. His eyes closed, his hand fell to his side, and his chest stilled. His body began to fragment into 1,000 tiny shards of light, and they floated upwards, sparkling and twinkling towards the moon. And far away in a distant land, there was a man and his wife sitting around a fire, eating a delicious meal, when they noticed this bright new star, and it reminded them of their son. And they spoke to each other and wondered how he was getting on with all his adventures in the land in the sky. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. What a treat. That story is so powerful when you read it, but to see you perform it is another thing entirely. I'd really like to focus on the shadow man a bit. It's such an important figure throughout the book. And I wanted to ask, like, why is it so important? Why was it important to you to include the shadow man and all the things that he represents?
So, yeah, people have asked me about the shadow man, and it's actually quite difficult to say exactly what the shadow man is. I guess the easiest one, I suppose, is probably fear, because we all have that voice inside us that tells us you're not good enough, you're not strong enough, you being you is just not enough. But then there's also, you know, he speaks to Jeddah all the time. and he tries to kind of, pull her down and prevent her from opening this box. But then he also appears in all the stories, because the shadow man is ever present in our lives. And there's a bit sort of towards the beginning where, okay, clearly she's on Arthur's seat, although Arthur's seat is never mentioned, but you can see the water and the bridges in the distance. So Africa and Scotland are never mentioned in the book, although that's the greatest, that's my inspiration for it. But she's up on the top of this mountain, and she's speaking to the shadow man, and he kisses her and he enters into her. And that for me is also, fear is really comforting sometimes. It's actually really easy for us to kind of keep fear close to us, because the alternative is, we just can't bear thinking about the alternative. So so it's just this permanent voice that constantly exists. And it's not just about sort of bringing yourself down, it's about how we see other people. So even in that story, I tell you all the time, and that, I guess, for me was about the media. Everywhere you go, it's like, we see it in the newspapers, how black people are described. Black terrorists as opposed to white terrorists are always, the language is very, very different. So, this shadow man is constantly speaking and giving us ideas of, and othering, everybody. It's like, this is what this person is like. If they've got this kind of hair, they must be like this. If they've got this kind of clothing, they must be like this. So that voice that constantly speaks to us and just kind of tears us apart and seeks to break the connection that we have with other people. So I thought it was really, really quite powerful. And when I was doing the show, we had, especially the young audiences, the teenage audiences, they loved the shadow man, I guess, because they're he was speaking to her through the mirror and just sort of things about your hair, and you have to straighten your hair, or your body, you have to shrink your body in order to fit in with sort of what people believe the standards of beauty are. So it's just that voice. Yeah.
Yeah, at times I wasn't sure if it was whiteness in general, but I think, and sometimes maybe it takes that on, but it's also more because it appears in the book where it kind of predates whiteness, I suppose. I think this is going to be my last question, so you can start thinking of your questions for the Q&A. You talked a bit about, Arthur's Seat, Scotland, Africa aren't mentioned by name in the book, but I think place plays such an important part in the story. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the relationship between place and stories, why that's important in the book, and maybe why it's important to you.
Yeah, so obviously I said earlier that I grew up in Kenya, and I go back every year. This year I was there for a few months. And so I have regular periods back there, so it's hugely influential on how I see my place in the world. But then I live in Scotland, I love Scotland, so I feel very much a part of both places. And the stories that I have acquired, I think I'm very lucky to exist in the storytelling world of Scotland. So, I know the Kelpies and the Selkies and the fairies and hundreds of these kinds of stories. So you grow up with the richness of the Celtic deities, and as well as, the stories from my childhood. And I just take, I take from everywhere, and I kind of bring it all together and just kind of create my own. And I think that there's a real richness in that, because sometimes the stories are very, very different. But at the same time, a lot of the threads are quite similar. So it's, one story that you hear in one place might have similar roots in a story that you get from another place. And it's the essence of the story that I'm always really interested in. Because you might hear a story and it's not that great a story, but there's a seed of the story that is like, that's the story, and then you can just sort of take away all the excess and you build something else around that particular idea. Even with this particular story here, there's a lot of symbolism in it, like the land in the sky. It's kind of, I think it's quite obvious what the land in the sky, symbolizes. Obviously, it's here, but then also the rope that leads to the land in the sky is for me, it was immigration and the process of the hoops that people constantly have to jump through in order to get to this land in the sky, and it's an extremely expensive process, very, very expensive. So this gold that is given, they're like, oh, okay, now we'll take your money, now you can come in. But also, I think, this land in the sky, for somebody who has grown up in Kenya, a colonized country, there is this idea of what the West is, and it's something to aspire to. It's a place to aspire to. Everything about it it's the land of milk and honey. And I think, I think that idea is changing in many ways, very, very slowly, but it still exists, and it's important to acknowledge that it exists, because it's also not true. There is no land of milk and honey. Yes, there are many opportunities, but there are opportunities in different places, and it's about how we look at those opportunities. It's about just uncovering what we value and actually what we appreciate about ourselves, and finding a way to make that work in whatever situation that we're in. But I think I guess for me, it's also, it's about trying to rid yourself of the shadow man. It's because that shadow man exists in every individual, in every human being on the planet, and we have to find ways to get rid of it, but at the same time we have to acknowledge that the shadow man exists in other people as well. So we can be totally free of the shadow man, but there are consequences because we can't control the shadow man in other people as well. So that's, I don't know if I've answered your question. I went off on a tangent.
Absolutely. But yeah, I lied. I have one more question as a follow-up to that. About the questions, and you're talking about ridding yourself of the shadow man. There's a kind of invitation in the book to ask yourself your own stories and to tell your own stories. And I'm wondering, like, what's next for you? Like, what's next from this book, and what are the other questions that are coming up for you?
So right now, I guess just with all the problems that the world has gone through over the last few months, particularly, it's been very, very condensed, and there's just been a lot of really difficult things that people have been dealing with. And so I'm really interested in mental health, but I'm also interested in how different cultures and communities also deal with that. Just because, I come from a family where the ancestors are very important, and that kind of spiritual element and religion kind of plays a part in that. So, for example, I have an older sister who has learning difficulties. My mother is an educated woman, and has worked in the medical industry, and yet at the same time we went back to Kenya and went to see the witch doctor who had cat bones to try and fix learning difficulties. So there is something in us that seeks, that kind of tries to find answers out with logic and out with science and out with the things that we're supposed to understand. And for me, when I'm kind of thinking about mental health also, within the Black community as well, a lot of people don't want to access the Western form of treatment. So it's kind of looking at that, but also from the other perspective as well. Sometimes you do have visits from ancestors or a certain spirituality that a trained professional might not necessarily understand either. So it's like, I can just imagine a conversation, say, I can't help you unless you talk to me. It's like, I can't talk to you if you don't listen. So it's always that kind of, that dynamic and that sort of conflict as well. So I'm interested in, mental health, spirituality, religion, culture, background, ancestors. Yes. Yeah,
all the small things.
All the small things.
Thank you so much. Can you say thank you tomorrow?
Thank you.
Okay, so over to you guys. Mari is going to come around with the roving mic. There we go. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question. Thank you.
I'll go the back and then the front.
Hi. Thank you so much for that. That was so beautiful, and I thank you so much for everything that you do. My question is, how do you decide what to write and what stories to tell?
I guess with the storytellers and maybe writers as well, it's the story finds you. I don't ever set out to find a story. It's just whatever speaks to you at a particular moment in time, and then that one idea that you have, suddenly it begins to attract a whole load of other ideas. And it could be stories that you heard as a child. It could be, a line that you read in a book. It could be, something that you experience just sort of walking around. And then all of these things suddenly kind of grow into something else. So I never set out to write or create a story. I might be just, having a coffee and then, oh my God, that's it. I've got a story. And it just pops into my head, and then begins the crafting crafting of the story. Yeah, because also one thing that people do is like, oh, you're a storyteller, tell us a story, tell us a story. You're like, oh, but yeah, the really good ones, they do take a lot of effort to kind of, because when you're telling the story as well, you have to understand, or as a storyteller, I kind of approach it from the perspective is that, you know, I might have this intention for having written blood and gold, you know, exploring the legacy of colonialism and slavery, but at the same time, I know that not everyone is going to receive it in that way, because every single person is on a different point in their life's journey, and so what I'm trying to say might not necessarily hit home, but we're planting seeds all the time. We're planting seeds, and so, you know, it might be in, you know, 10 years, someone says, oh my God, I remember, that's what they were trying to say, you know. So it's just understanding that also people will take things very, very differently, and trying to find a way to craft it in such a way that it will feed into as many people as possible, regardless of who that person might be. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You'd mentioned using storytelling to approach FGM, or the mass eye, and I'm really interested in how, if you have any other examples of like using storytelling for activism and what your experience of that as well. I'm interested.
Yeah, so the last one, that was just sort of, I think, the month before the first lockdown. So last year, I was in Colombia, and it was working with young people who were living with the legacy of the war. So they hadn't actually lived through the war, but they were living with disappeared parents. There had been an awful lot of sexual assault. There was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of different issues that these young people aged sort of 16 to 24 were dealing with. And they never tell stories. And I guess when you're in that situation, then it's a very isolating experience, and you begin to internalize, and it's a very painful experience. But by using stories and finding ways to encourage the stories to come out in their own time, and not forcing any particular story to come out as well. It's just, you know, we'll draw a picture of your neighborhood, you know, and, you know, okay, if this is the pharmacy or this is a school or whatever, it doesn't have to be a physical, geographical, you know, map or anything. It's just, you know, draw your childhood. And then these places, just actually what you're saying about place and story, you know, these places have significance to each of the individuals, for example, and then they begin to say, well, when I was here, this is where I always used to visit my grandmother. So it's not all negative, you know, sometimes they're positive stories as well, but it kind of begins to focus people's attention actually on just a bit of self-awareness as well, and then you just need one person to start telling a few other stories, and then it kind of triggers other people to also feel comfortable sharing some of the stories. But in that situation, it's really important also to have the backup, professional backup. So there was a clinical psychologist present as well, because once people start telling their stories, I'm not, you know, professional, so I wouldn't be able to necessarily handle the aftermath, and also I'm there for a very limited period of time. I was there for 3 weeks, so what happens after I'm gone? So there had to be things put in place to make sure that the young people were protected. So, but yeah, stories, you can tell very, very little folk tales. I'll tell one right now, a 30-second story. Frog and rabbit walking through a forest, talking, enjoying themselves, and they don't see a big hole by the side of the road, so Frog falls in. And he's hopping, trying to get out, can't get out. So Rabbit goes and gets help, and he drags a big ladder an hour later, but there's Frog on the side of the road, and he says, what happened? And he said, when you left, a snake fell into the hole. I had to get out. Now, that's the story, but you know, we have had hours and hours and hours analyzing that little story, because it could be, you know, for me, you know, that frog kind of hopping, we're all in habit. We all kind of try to get out of situations by doing exactly the same thing over and over again, but stories actually give us the tools to be able to think of, right, how am I going to get out? You know, in one story it might teach you, oh, look for the footholds. In another story it might teach you, oh, look for the vines that might pull you out. So stories are really tools that enable us to kind of explore our world and look at it from different perspectives, and that absolutely helps us. So one story can actually have real value, like huge amounts of value and wisdom. And just by exploring that, then also people will kind of, it triggers memories in people, and their own personal experiences come into play. So there you go. Yeah. Hi.
I wanted to ask about whether and how you kind of find comfort from, or whatever you need from knowing about kind of your family history or heritage or ancestors. I don't really know very much about my family other than one generation back, and it's something that I'm now coming to feel the loss of and feeling kind of anchorless, rudderless, and I wondered what I should be looking for when I'm trying to find out more about the stories of my own ancestors.
It's a really good question, because I think, nowadays we don't find out those stories. And one of the stories that kind of flies out of the box, it was actually based on personal history. It was the story of how my mother came to Scotland. And it was, my grandfather was the messenger boy for the British government. So he was 7, 8, 9 years old, and he was always doing the running around, getting tea, doing this. And he saw that the governor's wife was the one doing all the work, researching, writing reports and speeches, and handing it over to her husband. So he thought, so women can actually learn, because he came from a culture where, the boys would be educated, but a girl is a girl like a cow is a cow. That's kind of the mentality. And so when he married my grandmother, they went on to have 3 daughters, and he decided to send them to school. And it was a massive problem for the family. So I switched it in the story to pay homage to my grandfather, because they actually poisoned him. And my grandmother, there's a tradition called wife inheritance. So she would then be forced to marry his brother, because the brother would assume the responsibilities of the deceased. And she thought, nope, not having that. And so she ran away with 3 kids. And she was a village girl, so no money, no connections, like this world. Her world was tiny, but she thought, I don't want this life. So she ran away, and she couldn't afford to keep my mother, so she put my mother in an orphanage. So my mother was raised by Scottish nuns. And then she was sponsored, and she came to Edinburgh to study nursing. So that is the journey of my mother. But she told me this when I was, 34, 35. And when she told me that, I was like, how come you never told me that story before? It's a huge story, because I didn't know. Yeah, I was like, gosh, imagine if she had passed and the story had been lost. It totally changed how I saw my grandparents. And my grandfather was a real feminist, brilliant. And then my grandmother was just this badass, courageous woman who, she thought, no, I'm kind of breaking tradition. I'm going to, it must have been so frightening for her. And she decided to do it anyway with 3 small children. So my grandparents were amazing people. And we don't tell these stories, and we don't ask our parents or our grandparents stories. And sometimes I think what I found is that often, parents can have a difficult time sharing stories if they have gone through a difficult experience themselves. You might think, for example, refugee families, if it's very, very difficult, you want to protect your children, so you don't share the difficulty with them. But when it comes to the grandchildren, actually, they're like, it becomes a story. It's like, when I was younger, we crossed the oceans, and it was really difficult. There was no food. But you don't actually share it with your children. So sometimes it kind of skips generations as well. But also, somebody asked me that. It's like, you're proud of your ancestors, but what if you're not proud of your ancestors? And I hadn't thought about it before. But I also think now, when I think about it, is that, we're so, I think now as a society, we're very focused on me and now, and this is how things are. And we forget that we are just chapters in this very big book. And, we're not our ancestors. So if they were great, fantastic, learn from them. And also, I don't think that there is any good person or bad person. I think that we are also full of flaws and wonderful things. And it's about, appreciating that as well, and sort of kind of carrying ourselves forward. I think if you don't know family history, then oftentimes we fill in the gaps with our imagination. And I think that that's also okay, because if you have nothing else, then at least you have that. And oftentimes, if I'm creating stories about people from history and there's very limited information, then I have to do that. I have to imagine the gaps, but that imagining is drawn from reality as well, in a sense, because I know that this is the politics of the time, this is the cultural norms of the time, this is the attitudes to women of the time, and you kind of bring all of that into play, because you have to, you want to create a story that rings true and that also is kind of part of your story as well, because it's you tell a story because you like the story or because the story means something to you, so you're going to put yourself into that story. So if you find out. If there is any possible way of finding out, then it's about making a conscious effort to do that. And if it's impossible to find out, then, even just sort of finding about how they lived and speaking to other people who have memories of them as well. Yeah. And if not, you are you. And that's cool.
Hello.
Hi.
I was actually going to ask a totally different question that jumped on your question. I was going to ask about your experiences, because you toured in 27 different countries, what your experiences were performing for different kinds of people and the different ways maybe that you adapted your storytelling. But you've totally inspired me too. I wanted to ask about the role of rage and forgiveness in your stories, how you process rage and forgiveness, what you think the role is of rage and forgiveness when you're telling the story, because the story that you told us now was so incredible and impactful, and I had that moment when I was like, please don't let that be the boy who is going to be killed, this boy who carries all the hope for his parents, and it hurts so much. So I wonder what that role is for you, or how you imagine rage and forgiveness when you're telling the story to your audience. And maybe you just pick which question you want to ask.
They're so good. I think when it comes, I'm kind of always going through a little bit of self-analysis and sort of trying to figure out who I am along the way. And of course, you're changing, and you're like, God, I can't believe I thought that way 2 weeks ago. But I love. I don't know. For me, the universe just throws me gifts all the time. Tells me a line or gives me a sense, or there's a quote that I read somewhere. And there was one about forgiveness. Now I can't remember who wrote it, but it's forgiveness is the fragrance that a flower leaves on the heel of the one who crushes it. And it's a really beautiful quote. So yeah, it's not my quote, it's somebody else's, so you can Google it and find out who it is. But that one really spoke to me because I think it's really easy to be filled with rage. And it's really easy to find that quite a cathartic process, in the same way that we love fear, in the same way that we cling to, we cling to trauma because it affects us, and it kind of, I don't want to say it excuses things, because I don't think that's accurate either, but I think it's a way that we're able to kind of process the world, and if things are going wrong, it allows us, it kind of validates that and gives us reason, it justifies, well, this is how I feel, and it's just because of X, Y, Z. And it takes effort to forgive. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, but it's also a very necessary thing to do in order to free yourself, and in order to move on, and in order to get rid of that shadow man that we all have. Otherwise, we're kind of keeping a part of it inside us, and I struggle with it all the time, so it's, I like my rage, and I like wallowing and eating chocolate and being pissed off at the world. I enjoy that, but there comes a point, it's like, right, you kind of have to stop this now, and it's a conscious thing. So I think it's just, the two qualities, human qualities that I admire are kindness and compassion. They're the ones that speak most to me, and so I try to live a life that is as close to that as possible. And that requires elements of forgiveness. So. I think even with kind of some of the stories in there, it's very easy to be angry all the time at colonialism, because I see Kenya is ravaged by so many problems, and it's kind of easy to say, well, it's just all a bit shit now, and then nothing's going to happen, and it's because of X, Y, Z. But then you hear a story about my grandfather, who actually did something really positive in that period as well, that kind of changed the course of my life. If he hadn't done it, then I would still be a village girl, collecting water with 100 children. So people kind of work through these in lots of different ways, and I've kind of gone everywhere, but I can't remember the first question. Oh, about different places. It is fascinating, because there's some cultures that are just okay with storytelling. They're used to it, so you throw out a word and they know that they have to respond. I was in Singapore once, and it was a Chinese audience that came, and it was, I think, were they sort of P7s kind of age, like 12, 13, and they were told to sit on their hands. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? So as soon as I had control, it was like, right, we'll need to get rid of that. And then once they were given permission to be free and wriggle and move and to come closer, then, they were in there just like that. And it was, there were no barriers. And One of the best audiences that I ever had was also in Singapore, and they didn't tell me, but it was a school from like a high school. They were kids aged sort of 13 to probably 18, I guess, but it was a special needs school. And I was like, oh my God, a little bit of warning would have been nice, because I'm very tactile with the storytelling and I can't help it sometimes. And, with special needs, you kind of need to be a little bit more careful, just because you don't know how people are going to respond necessarily to touch. But they had zero inhibitions at all. They were on the stage, they were talking, they were shouting, you'd ask something and they'd be responding. And they were just the most amazing audience ever. So it really depends, I try to, I keep the language as simple as possible, because I know that English is not always going to be the first language, and you don't know, you might, if you're telling a story to a bunch of academics, then you might change the way you tell the story. So you're constantly tweaking. You've got seconds really to sort of read the room and make a decision, like, okay, how am I going to tell my stories based on the mood? If the mood is a bit low, kind of ease into it, and then finally you get it up. If the mood is like, then you're straight in there. So yeah, you've got seconds to read the room and see how people are going to respond, and then you work with it, you go with it. Yeah, but I think that just comes with practice, I guess. It was very different, and when the publishers approached me and said, we love the show, we'd like you to turn this into a novel, and I was like, yeah, great. And then you've got an idea of what a writer is like, so I had my laptop and my wine and my chocolates, and it was ready. And then nothing happened. I could not do anything. And it's like, oh my God. And I had a deadline, and it was just hell. So then I thought, okay, I'm a storyteller, so what I'm good at is just telling stories. So I told story. My secret was the voice typing tool on Google Docs. Yeah. So I would just tell the story, because I guess I'm lucky. The way it's sort of written is that it's chunks of stories. So there is a story about how fear comes into the world. There is the story of, the first story that kind of flies out of the box. So there's that kind of chunk. So it's done in chunks. So I was able to just tell a piece or story, and then you stop and you go over it line by line, correcting the inevitable errors and spellings and all of that, but then also to try and find ways to really bring it to life, because when you're telling stories, you don't need to say, oh, she was really sad, because the audience can see that in your expression and your physicality, but on paper, the words are everything. Whereas storytelling, the audience is everything. If you fail to, work with your audience, then you're lost, whereas with the written form, it's the words. So then you have to go into a little bit more description. In the stage show, there were no names of characters because it wasn't necessary. But in order to differentiate the characters in the written form, it was necessary to kind of give them names and clearly identify who was who, because when you're performing, then your physicality will change. So if you're talking about two young girls, one might be like this and the other one might be like this, or whatever, or one might be like this. So you can just change your physicality to indicate who is who, but with the written form you can't. But I remember having a bit of a panic in July, I think June or July, because all of the drafts had been done. And then I suddenly thought, oh my God, it's written, it's fixed, I can't change it. That's it. And then people are going to read it. And then I didn't know how they were going to take it, especially when you're talking about something like, the legacy of colonialism and slavery. It's, it sounds very heavy. And even in the stage show, I think there were some people who were expecting a more heavy-handed approach, because I think that's what we're used to, It's about, this is really wrong, and it was this, and da-da-da, da-da-da, and there's an anger, that rage that you were talking about, the rage that comes with that narrative, and I was deliberately trying not to, or not deliberately trying, I came at it from a different perspective, basically. So there is a lot of rage, and there is a lot of grief, and there is a lot of loss, but there is also joy, in there as well. So I also know that, people can take one line and out of context, and it becomes something completely different. Whereas when you're telling a story, I think people kind of receive it in the full context. They get the emotion of the story, and they understand what is being said. So yeah, it was difficult for me at the end to also think, oh my God, I can't change it, and that's it. But I quite enjoyed the difference in kind of telling stories as opposed to writing stories. Because it's a very, very different art form, very, very different. And it's always nice to try out new ways of sharing stories. But yeah, so hopefully another one at some point, yeah.
If not, there was one that came in from Pete at the back of the room.
The mic won't extend that far, right?
The book is about strength and overcoming, and it also features many elders. Are those things connected for you? And do you find that different elders, grandmother or chief, offer different forms of strength?
Yes, they do. I guess, I was very, very close to my grandmother, and she was an elder, and, but she didn't care. She hadn't been contaminated by the world in the same way that people are contaminated now, because she lived in a village, so there were no billboards, there was no advertising, there was no magazines, so there was no expectation that she had to be a certain way. She was purely herself, and she loved Drambuie. They reconnected. My mother and my grandmother reconnected later on. But yeah, I had a very, very close relationship with her, and she was extremely wise and wicked and funny and quite brutal in lots of ways. She was, I suppose, quite a hard woman, but because of everything that she encompassed, she was hugely influential on me. My mother was the opposite. She's just really kind and really selfless, kind of one of those too selfless people. I'm like, I don't want to be that selfless. Kind, but not, stupid. Sorry, Mum. So they, and she is now an elder as well. But I also think that, we are on our way to becoming elders. And I think I don't believe that it's only elders who have this wisdom that they then pass down to us. I think that in many ways we can also inspire the elders. I think that we can give them ideas and give them thoughts and give them reasons for why we do the things we do, and remind them also of their youth, and because we live in very, very different worlds. So for me, they're a bridge. They're a bridge to a different time. They're a bridge to a different place and a different way of thinking and a way of being. And I think there's real value in that. And especially when they come from different places, So I love speaking to people from little fishing villages in Orkney, for example, because I can't imagine what that life would have been. And 50, 60, 70 years ago, it would have been completely different to how it is now. So it's they give me an awful lot of ideas and inspiration because they're very true. I think speaking to elders is they don't mince their words, and they don't try to be polite, and they don't try to people please all the time. They don't have to be politically correct. So it's refreshing to speak to them. So I enjoy it. Yeah. But I really love the dynamics of when you've got very young people and very old people together. I think there's something quite magical in that space that happens. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mara. I just wanted to mention Blood and Gold is available here to buy now. I think you can find copies up near the till, and Mara will be available to sign some copies as well in the corner if anyone would like. But yeah, that's all from us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming. Thank you.